So the key takeaway for me is if you don't define your brand associations, algorithms and audiences will define them for you, or you'll be left out of conversations. So it's important to build and reinforce the links that you want in people's minds and in machines' maps, or risk being invisible in 2026. I'm Christian Rigg, and this is SEO in 2026.
Christian, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
So for me, 2026 is all about brand associations in people's minds, in search engines, in LLMs. Optimizing for brand associations means building deep and meaningful connections between your brand and topics, products, features, outcomes, all of the things that matter to people and machines.
Okay, so I was going to ask you for the definition of brand associations there as well, but you certainly touched upon that as well. Shall we delve into a little bit more depth in terms of what you mean by how to create a brand association by leveraging topics, products, and features that you mentioned there?
Yeah, for sure. So if we're speaking in terms of what exactly can people do to achieve this, I think we can start with like a really good definition of a brand association, or at least a few good examples. And I mentioned this on the last time that you and I did a recording together. So things like Kleenex and tissue paper, for example, or Dove and natural beauty, Patagonia and sustainability, Apple and innovation. So these kinds of associations that people have between brands and values or products and features. And we know that these exist both in a neurological sense and in a machine sense, the way that algorithms like LLMs and search engines through the knowledge graph, for example, approach the idea of finding information is through associations. And the human mind works in a similar way. So the task is all about how do we create these associations in the wild? And I think there's a few different ways to do this, but it all starts with kind of understanding what you want those associations to be. So that might mean, even just sitting down with a pen and a piece of paper and thinking about your brand and your product and all of the best associations that you want with it. Thinking about your product space and the kinds of things that your customers or potential customers care about, talk about, the benefits that your product offers, the benefit of the benefit, as we say. So those kinds of emotional associations of having more free time or being able to do something more easily, these kinds of things. And then also thinking about the values that are important to your brand and that you want people to see in you and see reflected, kind of their own reflection in your company. So just kind of brainstorming, writing down what all of those are, and then going out and seeing which of those already exist in the wild. So seeing what kind of associations come up when you search for your own brand on search, on LLMs, on LinkedIn, on Reddit, on all of the different spaces that your customers might exist, and identifying any that already exist, any that exist but need to be deepened, and of course, any negative associations that you might want to deal with.
So I love the phrase that you came up with there. Brand associations exist in a neurological sense, and I quickly looked up. Neurological sense refers to any of the way the nervous system enables perception of the internal or external environment. So it's more than just how a brand is seen and perhaps read. It's that whole experience, that feeling that you get with the brand, almost a physical feeling as well. And I was just going to ask you about, you mentioned Patagonia and a couple of other examples there as well. How have they gone about ensuring that the feel that people get of their brand is different and substantial and everlasting compared with other brands that don't manage to achieve the same levels?
Yeah, for sure. It's a really good question, and I won't pretend to be an expert in all different levels of marketing. I work in content marketing, and so that's where most of my expertise tends to stick. But I would say that they look for opportunities to present themselves in unique and unusual ways, in ways that are really going to stick in the minds of people. And they do so with incredible consistency. I think one of the problems that a lot of companies have, especially before they really find their niche, is they try to go after a really broad range of values, outcomes, etc. And some of the best pieces of advice that I've taken on and that I've seen on LinkedIn from other SEO experts and content marketing experts is to identify just the 3 or 4 things that are really, really core and important, and to have everything that you do come back to those things. So with Patagonia, they do lots of really interesting marketing things that don't necessarily, they're not just necessarily going out and marketing their product. If you go on their website, they have an entire blog section that's dedicated to adventure and people, climbing mountains and going down rivers and all of these things that the people who are interested in Patagonia and connect with, it really resonates with them. And then through those stories, they're able to talk about sustainability. And so they're able to bring the association Patagonia sustainability into virtually everything that they do, but in really unexpected and unique ways. And that's something that really helps strengthen those neurological connections that we had just mentioned. Because anything that kind of gets the human brain to stop and kind of wake up and be like, oh, that's not what I was expecting, and kind of lean in, neurologically, that's going to create much stronger associations than when everything is just kind of happening in the status quo. Your brain is kind of just on autopilot.
So when you say identify 3 things that are really important and come back to those things, who in an organization do SEOs need to have conversations with in order to establish those elements and ensure that everyone within certainly the marketing teams embrace those things?
Yeah. So if the company has already kind of done its due diligence, then hopefully these values are going to be things that are felt by all the employees and all of the individuals who work there and are going to come through really strong. So something that, when you do your onboarding at that company, then you're going to already know what the values are and you're going to already know what the outcomes and the benefits are meant to be associated with your product. And a lot of the companies that we've worked with have done this in a really great way. And so it's very easy for us to come in with, with our writers and our content marketers and take what they have and run with it. If that hasn't been done in your company, then I'd say it really falls to direction. So CEO, CMO, COO, all of the people at the top who are really, their responsibility is defining what these values are and making sure that they're propagated throughout the company. I firmly believe that a company can't demonstrate something that it doesn't do itself internally. People have to really feel it and believe it for it to come through in the content that they create and in the products even that they create. Apple is probably a really good example of this, where I think the people who work there kind of live and breathe Apple. So who do you ask? Leadership. And if leadership hasn't done it yet, then that's the time to do it.
I think it's one thing to obviously establish what you're suggesting with a relatively new brand, but you obviously have brands that have been around for a long time, and perhaps existing negative stories or historical values that exist within that brand. So what do you do with those historical values or negative stories? Is it worthwhile trying to suppress them or change the narrative? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. And once again, I don't claim to be a PR expert. I'm sure there are others out there who could answer this question with much more finesse than I can. But I think it comes down to 2 things. First of all, no, I wouldn't say it's worth burying them. When I worked in tourism, I worked in hospitality for a number of years before getting into marketing. Obviously, sometimes bad reviews happen. And the best thing that we could do from a brand perspective, and that worked well for us, was demonstrating how seriously we took, complaints or bad reviews on the platform. So responding to what people said, thanking them for bringing the problem to our attention, demonstrating the steps that we had taken to resolve the issue and make sure that it wasn't going to happen again. And, just being very visible in the fact that we have maybe recognized the problem if there was one, and the steps that we've taken to correct it. I think it does take some soul searching. If you have a company that is facing some negative publicity, it's very easy to have a knee-jerk reaction. But I've always seen it as a good opportunity to try to understand where the public is coming from and what the issue is and whether there actually is something that needs to be done. Your question makes me think of BrewDog, for example, that have this very kind of like punk imagery that they've since kind of like adapted and moved away from, not because it was necessarily bad for them, but just because BrewDog, if you didn't know, like they got embroiled in quite a bit of scandal by the way that they were kind of treating their employees. And it was kind of this like big thing that was making waves, especially in some marketing circles. And so rather than, I think they tried to bury it a bit in the beginning, but I think when they saw that it was inevitably going to come out, it was more a question of asking, okay, well, what have we done wrong here? And what can we do to fix that? And then how do we demonstrate with authenticity and honesty, the fact that something has changed within the company? And then the second thing is just making sure that the good outweighs the bad and producing enough valuable, good, new content that you're going to be able to, over time, change people's associations and machines' associations.
So what does this all have to do with LLMs and optimizing for AI search? How does this help with that?
Yeah. So to the extent that we can know, because LLMs are very much a black box. We built the algorithms and we train them, but we can't look inside of an LLM and see exactly what the internal architecture looks like because it's just staggeringly complicated. Not as complicated as the human mind, but still very, very complicated. But I recently read this really interesting study that tried to apply some of the same methods that we've used to study associations in the human brain and see if that resonates with like the internal architecture of LLMs. And it turns out that they also build associations between words. I'm not going to say that they build associations between concepts or ideas because they don't understand concepts or ideas the same way that a human mind would. But there are associations between words. And, when you put a query into an LLM, that's essentially what's happening. The LLM is going to ingest the query. It looks for the next most appropriate word. And the way it does that is by kind of running it through this machine of different associations and saying, okay, well, they said red. So a rose is closer to red than a cloud, whatever. And doing this over millions and millions and millions of iterations very quickly, it identifies the next most appropriate word, and then it does this again. So you could almost say that LLMs are kind of like associative machines. They take something, they find the next most appropriate association, and they spit it out. And so building these associations is not just valuable for human minds, although it is very valuable. It's also valuable for the way that LLMs work and search algorithms, the way that Google search algorithm works, but especially LLMs because they've been built as these kind of association machines.
Christian, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
So the key takeaway for me is if you don't define your brand associations, algorithms and audiences will define them for you, or you'll be left out of conversations. So it's important to build and reinforce the links that you want in people's minds and in machines' maps, or risk being invisible in 2026.
Christian Rigg is Director of Operations at 11 Writing. Find out more over at 11writing.com. Christian, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Thanks so much for having me, David.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at SEOin2026.com.